On today's World Insight, in our special program Discovering Confucius, we speak to scholar Daniel Bell, who discusses how Confucianism prevailed over competing philosophies and why that makes it relevant to modern society.
Some Confucian ideas, like a very this-worldly approach, or the idea that we should save for future generations.
A towering ancient figure, a legendary sage, and a source of inspiration. As part of the enduring Chinese civilization. More than 2,500 years after Confucius was born, they accept my invitation to go back in history, discuss his ideas, and why he is particularly relevant today. Discovering Confucius.
Hello and welcome to our special program, Discovering Confucius, marking 2573rd anniversary of the birth of Confucius. He is a paramount philosopher in China's history, a great contributor to the wisdom of the world. After traveling on the train for more than 2 hours from Beijing, I'm now in Qufu, the birthplace of Confucius. Over the centuries, scholars and curious minds from around the world have been visiting this place in an effort to find out why it managed to nurture such a big name in human history. That was also the question Daniel Bell asked when he decided to leave Canada and come to China to research about Confucius and eventually stayed in Shandong for years. As the Dean of the School of Political Science and Public Administration with Shandong University, he is keen to dig deeper about China's Confucianism traditions, but even more importantly, why and how Confucianism matters today in China. As an episode of our special interview series, Discovering Confucius, I talked to Daniel Bell recently. A fascinating conversation. Daniel Bell, what a pleasure to see you again.
Pleasure to see you again, Tian 老师.
Well, there has been so much discussion about Confucianism and Confucius as a historical figure. What do you make of his relevancy today?
Well, I think one thing it's important to distinguish between Confucianism and other mainstream ethical or religious traditions, because when we think of some traditions like Christianity, we think that there's a founding father, Jesus. Saint Buddhism, we think of Buddha. Islam, we think of Muhammad. And Confucianism in English, it sounds like Confucius is the equivalent of Jesus or Buddha or Muhammad, but actually in Chinese, the term is much more clear, 儒家. It's a long tradition that predates Confucius himself. And Confucius is the most influential interpreter of that tradition, but he's only one interpreter. And he himself didn't write anything. It's his students who put his sayings together in what we call today the Analects of Confucius. And it was very kind of epigrammic, and it was developed into a more systematic tradition after his time by thinkers like Mengzi, Mencius, and Xunzi, both of whom developed their theories in what we now call Shandong province. So Shandong province is very dear to my heart.
Mm-hmm. Shandong, of course, is also where the state of Lu, where Confucius spent most of his time were, isn't it?
Right. So the state of Lu, it's a tiny little state, but it's where Confucius was born. And after he traveled to other states in the spring and autumn period before China was unified, trying to promote his ideas, that's where, frankly, he wasn't very successful. He returned to the state of Lu and served as a teacher, and that's where he's most influential. I mean, he's regarded as a teacher of teachers, and he had a very distinctive teaching technique. He had, a lot of students, some say up to 3,000, but there were about 70 or so that were very close students, and each one he would teach in a different way based on their personality or outlook. So he really tailored his teachings to the distinctive needs and interests of each student. In English, again, it's very misleading because you think of Confucius as boring old master who just propounds truths to kind of students who blindly take upon what he says, but actually what's remarkable about Confucius' teaching technique is that he really tailored what he said to each individual student.
It's such a luxury if you think about education. I would dream about that context if I were a student at any time.
I agree. And I mean, and that's where his model is still relevant today, because I think it's through these small seminar-like classes where the teacher interacts with each student based on their own personality, needs, and interests. That's the best way to learn. And actually, so in Shandong University, where I've been dean for 5 years, we try to promote this kind of Confucius-inspired teaching style. It's still very, very relevant today.
You talk about the warring states period of time. That's when a lot of different states, big or small, competing against one another. But if you think about it, Daniel, many say it's a very interesting phenomenon that the state of Qin, which eventually unified China, was actually based pretty much not on Confucius thoughts or Confucianism, but more on legalism, one of the most popular philosophical thoughts at the time. So how do you see this interesting phenomenon?
Well, that's true. So the Warring States period, as you say, it was incredibly bloody and obviously warring time of Chinese history, but was also lots of freedom of movement, and we can say freedom of speech, so that intellectuals like Confucius, Kongzi in Chinese, or Mencius, or Xunzi, or others like Mozi could go from state to state trying to promote their ideas. But as you say, the one who was most successful in doing so in terms of the state that ultimately unified China, actually, that's one thing that all the different schools at the time had in common, was that although there were many different outlooks, but they all agreed on the need to unify the country, or what they considered to be the whole world. And the school that went out eventually was this legalist school. In Chinese, it's Fajia, which really emphasizes the need for social order. And the way to have that social order is through laws that apply more or less equally to all, but that are ruthlessly enforced and that have harsh punishments. And the thinkers the thinker who systematized the legalist tradition was Han Feizi, and he eventually moved from his home state to the state of Qin, and on the basis of his ideas, partly the state of Qin was successful in defeating other states and unifying China, building the beginnings of the Great Wall, unifying the Chinese script, having a very complex bureaucratic system, having a rigorous kind of meritocratic system in the military. So again, it sounds cruel, but this is what happened. I mean, if you were a soldier, the way to be promoted is by the numbers of decapitated heads of enemy soldiers. So that was the system, but because the system was so cruel and in some sense inhumane, it only lasted, the first dynasty, about 15 years. And then the next major dynasty, the Han dynasty, lasted much longer, close to 400 years. And that incorporated some legalist practices, but very much the founding moral system was Confucianism. And that set the trend, so to speak, for the rest of Chinese imperial history, which invoked Confucianism as a leading value system for politics and for morality in everyday life, especially family morality. Legalism was still there unofficially in terms of influencing policies and actions, but for like a 2000 period between the Han dynasty, when there were some still debates between card-carrying legalists and Confucians, and the 20th century, even though no major thinker consciously invoked the legalist tradition, and neither did the government. It was there, but in a kind of unofficial way.
Thank you for this context that you set for us to understand better about quote unquote Confucianism vis-a-vis legalism. But of course, the term legalism itself sometimes could be a little bit misleading. It's not necessarily equivalent to the so-called rule of law or legal system, but rather
similar to that, yet with a very different context of history. So maybe you can help us to understand better about that too.
Well, I mean, if the Westerners think of the rule of law, they think that individuals have rights and they could use those rights as protection against state interference. I mean, that would be a mainstream view, certainly in the US. But I'm from Canada, so you have similar view here. But in the legalist tradition, it's more, I mean, to simplify a little bit, ruled by law, whereby the rulers would use law as a means to secure social order. And sometimes the laws were quite ruthlessly applied and sometimes didn't protect individuals. For example, there was family-based punishment. You know, if my brother committed a crime, and then I might be executed along with all the other family members. So it's different than what we might call Western influence ideas of rule of law. But there were some components that are kind of similar. I mean, the idea that everybody should be more or less equally subject to the rule of law or by law. I mean, you had seeds of that in legalism. I mean, the legalists didn't like these Confucian ideas whereby if I'm like a junzi, like an exemplary person, the rules would be different than for me compared to the xiaoren, to the kind of petty people. You know, the legalist says, no, the law should apply equally, ruthlessly to all. You know, so in that sense, you had the germs of an idea of equality before the law in Chinese style legalism as well.
And what does that mean for China's understanding of a law and rules if the historical context was as such you described?
Well, so again, because Confucianism was the major guiding value system, Confucians weren't against law, but for them, when it comes to social conflict, we shouldn't solve them first and foremost by legal means. We should seek out harmonious ways of resolving social conflict. You know, for example, if there's a conflict in the family, you would have a kind of community mediator who would try to resolve that. And only once these informal means fail, then the legal punishments might be invoked. Or the Confucians very much emphasize ritual, li, as a way of securing a sense of community and social order. If everybody more or less, and here's Xunzi, he's actually the teacher of Han Feizi, the first thinker who systematized legalism. Xunzi was he was at the end of the day, he was a Confucian who thought first and foremost we should use ritual as a way of securing a sense of community and caring within a group of people. And only if that fails should we invoke legal punishments. And for him, like literally, the better the society, the more we emphasize informal means of dealing with conflict, and the worse society, the more you invoke legal punishment. So whereas for the legalists, it's almost the opposite. They didn't believe that you could use informal means, whether it's ritual or moral persuasion or education or moral example. They thought people are base and selfish and narrowly self-interested, and they could only be controlled or regulated by means of harsh punishments. So that was a clear difference. So throughout Chinese imperial history, there were laws, but because of the heavy Confucian influence, there was also strong emphasis on informal ways of dealing with conflict. I think that's still very much a live issue today. Or to give you another example, on the dealing with the pandemic, of the COVID pandemic, of course, it's important to have rules that are enforced. But if people don't follow those norms, then it won't be effective. So in China, more or less for 2 years, there was a relatively successful way of dealing with COVID. And it wasn't so much because of the rules, it was because people recognized the need to care for the elderly parents. And for that, you need to protect them. For example, wearing masks within the family, that was never a big issue in China. And also there was respect for experts like Zhong Nanshan, who weren't just scientific experts. They were viewed as having moral conscience, or like modern day junzi. There was a very good way of dealing with COVID, mainly because of Confucian norms. And that I think it was similar in other countries too in East Asia that were relatively successful in dealing with COVID. It wasn't so much because of legalism, but more because of Confucian norms.
A towering ancient figure, a legendary sage, and a source of inspiration. As part of the enduring Chinese civilization. More than 2,500 years after Confucius was born, they accept my invitation to go back in history, discuss his ideas, and why he is particularly relevant today. Discovering Confucius.
Now you think about the world, some say it's fragmented, it's divided. How do you see a comparison about that period of history in ancient China to what we are going through today?
Well, that's an interesting idea. And there are scholars who draw comparisons along those lines. And for example, in the Warring States period, there was basically lip service to the Zhou rulers, and in a way that today contemporary states pay lip service to the UN, but it won't. But the UN or the Zhou dynasty won't have any effect if whatever they decide conflicts with the interests of individual countries or states. So in that sense, there's a clear parallel. But again, in the Warring States period, what was striking is that all schools of thought agreed on the need to have some sort of unified political community to solve the problems of their day.
There's a tradition in China, might be true also in other civilizations, that people try to learn from history and apply what they learned as if they were the real essence of solutions to what is happening today. Now, how relevant do you see that practice is? In other words, how relevant is it that we are still discussing Confucianism today?
Well, I mean, China, I think here it's different than, for example, Canada, where I was born and bred. I mean, China has a deep sense of historical consciousness, of belonging to a long, lasting, more or less continuous civilization. And the idea is history matters when it comes to thinking about contemporary problems and problems for the future. And intellectuals, as you know, frequently invoke history when thinking, just when in an everyday speech in a way that might seem very pompous. You know, if I'm talking to my Canadian friends and I invoke Canadian history to think about how to deal with problems today, or go back even further to invoke Shakespeare or Plato, you know, it would just seem very pompous. But in a Chinese context, not at all. History is very much alive in a way that's not true, I think, in most Western countries. I think that's the one remarkable fact about China. And if you want it really to understand China, you really have to have a historical consciousness and understanding in a way that might not be true in other countries. So like this goes to bring it back a bit to Confucius. I mean, again, like if it would be odd to, and if I'm from Canada, I want to make Plato as a kind of contemporary, you know, role model for thinking about how to reform Canadian politics or the international political system. But for Chinese to invoke Confucius doesn't seem, or Confucius, and again, it's not just Confucius, but the whole Confucian tradition looking for inspiration for thinking about dealing with today's problems, it seems quite natural. Of course, it wasn't true in the 20th century in China when arguably the main tradition was anti-traditionalism, right? When China was poor, it was easy to blame tradition for China's problems. Once China becomes wealthy, people look around and see other states that have Confucian tradition and think, hey, this actually allowed for economic development rather than constraining it. You know, some Confucian ideas like a very this worldly approach, or the idea that we should save for future generations, or the idea that we should value education. I mean, all these are highly conducive to modernization. And there was never an organized Confucian resistance against modernization. And also just, once people achieve a certain degree of material wealth, then they say, hold on a second,
Are you trying to say the relevancy of Confucius or Confucianism today is pretty much a perception rather than a reality, because it is not necessarily the reason for all the failures. It's not necessarily all the solutions for success. Is that what you're trying to say?
No, I would say it's much more than a perception. Even in the darkest days of the, let's say, tradition of anti-traditionalism, there was still lots of Confucianism there at everyday social level. The way that children treated parents, or the way that students interact with teachers, or the way that, in Shandong province, when we have banquets, it's very formal rituals that owe a lot to the Confucian tradition, including drinking rituals. Those may not have been labeled Confucian, but they're always there. More recently, to give you another example, for the festival, the grave sweeping festival, that started informally, where people would just take the day off and go to their ancestors' graves and pay tribute. Eventually, so many hundreds of millions of people in China took the day off that the state made it into a holiday, Qingmingjie, right? So much of this, it's at the level of everyday practice and social behavior. It's been there, and it's only recently that people are using the conscious language of Confucianism and the Confucian tradition to make sense of it.
Very interesting. And finally, before we go, Daniel, how do you see the apparent revival of interest in history, especially ancient history, ancient philosophy, ancient poetry, and also ancient arts and calligraphy in today's China?
This is quite stunning if you compare it to other countries, because in most other countries, there's this dramatic decline of interest in the humanities and funding for the humanities, and people pursuing humanities in education. But in China, it's the opposite, where the past few decades, there's been a dramatic increase in interest in humanities, in the culture and history and music and calligraphy, as you say, and also dramatic increase in funding for those arts by the government in the educational sector. Now, why did that happen? Well, I think it's partly against the background of the 20th century, when so much of Chinese tradition was devalued. And now I think there's a widespread recognition among intellectuals and among people in the government that this was a huge mistake. There's so much to be proud of, and we should try and assert what's best of our tradition and culture while still being open to learning from the best of other cultures. Whereas and of course that doesn't mean that other countries don't have similar ideas.
You have been doing research about Confucius, Confucianism, Neo-Confucianism for decades. Now, you have also participated in many intellectual debates. You see how the study of it and relevancy of it throughout China over the past few decades, which of course has been evolving quite dramatically in almost every field. Now, Daniel, if there's one direction about Confucius or Confucianism that you would love to dig deeper, what would that be?
Well, let me first say, one of the problems in the Confucian tradition that needs to be addressed, and I think is being addressed to a certain extent, is the patriarchal aspect, which seems to favor the interests of men over women. Obviously, that's inappropriate for modern day societies where we value gender equality. That dark side of the Confucian tradition needs to be addressed. But there are aspects of the Confucian tradition that I think are so beautiful and can and should be revived. Again, this emphasis on informal rituals as a way of generating community and caring among people. And whether they're hierarchical or not, it doesn't matter. What matters is that the people at all levels of society, including the bottoms of the hierarchy, benefit from those rituals. That's what's so important. Any society that tries to deal with things according to rational procedures or laws exclusively or primarily, I think is in deep trouble. So here I'm with the Confucians. I think also the pursuit of harmony as a way of dealing with social relations. But here there's also an interesting idea, or it's a kind of mistranslation or misleading view of what harmony means in English. I mean, in English, when you hear harmony, you tend to think of conformity. Or I remember watching the 2008 Beijing Olympics opening ceremony, and I was listening to American journalists, and they were remember the character for harmony, He, was viewed as representing all of the best of Chinese culture, and they were saying, the journalists were saying, oh, look at this, all those soldiers are marching in unison, they all think alike, they're all brainwashed. We know in Chinese, He er bu tong, it's every Chinese intellectual knows this saying that exemplary persons value harmony, but not tong, which we can translate as conformity or uniformity or sameness. There's a clear distinction. In Chinese, harmony means diversity in harmony. It means respecting diversity and pluralism and difference. So it's different. So if we want to translate terms like harmony, like He, we really need to emphasize it's diversity and harmony. It's totally different than tong, or sameness or conformity. A lot of these issues, I think, if we're dealing with foreigners, we need to clarify some of these translation issues.
And it also has a lot to do with our own, in China's own sophisticated level of understanding of traditions and philosophies. Thank you so much, Daniel, for providing inspirations to many of us throughout the years. Thank you, appreciate it.
My conversation with Daniel Bell on Confucianism, why it matters in today's China and the world. With that, we're coming to the end of this episode of our special program, Discovering Confucius, from the hometown of Confucius in Qufu. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of my team in Qufu and Beijing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow.